Hey, maybe you've heard the story. If you have, just pretend that you haven't. About the man who went to Israel with took his family, extended family, to go to Israel for a vacation. And while he was there, his mother-in-law, who was with them on the trip, passed away in Israel. And his wife was so distraught about her mother that he was trying to handle all the funeral arrangements. And the man, that he was working with there in Israel, he said, probably to ship the body, prepare the body, and then ship it all the way back to America is going to be close to $15,000. He says, but we can do a funeral here for about $2,000. And the man thought for a minute. He said, I appreciate the offer, but we want to ship her back to America. And he said, I just hate for you to have to spend that kind of money. He said, that's okay. He says, well, do you mind telling me why you don't want her buried here in Israel? And he says, well, just to be honest with you, about 2,000 years ago, y'all buried a man here, and he came back from the dead. He said, I can't afford to take that chance. So, if your mother-in-law's here today, would you give her a hug? So, when you talk about Jesus, you eventually come back to the resurrection. You can't talk about Jesus but so long that things come back to the resurrection. And in this series that we've been doing, newsflash, Jesus makes the headlines, and where we've taken a look at over the last 4 weeks, 4 events or sayings or teachings that Jesus had how they would have made the headlines today with the media coverage that we have today. But we cannot finish out that series today without talking about the biggest headline that there ever was, and that's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Can't you just see the headlines today if the tomb was found empty, and all of the headlines and the news flashes and the reporters and everybody on scene, some people believing it, some saying it was a hoax, and most of us not knowing what to think. Well, what I want us to do today is look at this event through the eyes of his followers of that morning when they found an empty tomb. Particularly, I want us to think about Simon Peter. Put yourself in the place of these followers, these disciples, and maybe especially Peter again. They had left everything. They had left everything. Their jobs, Matthew walks away from his job. Peter, a fisherman, they leave the family business, everything. They had just left everything behind and spent basically every minute for 3 years with Jesus. But now he's dead. This was not supposed to happen. They had seen him live an invincible life, and now he's dead. Can they go back to their old way of living? I mean, are there jobs for them to go back to, or would they be the laughing stock in the towns that they went back to? Are they now on the hit list? Are they next to be executed by the Jewish leaders and the Roman government? Doubt and fear had to be through the roof because this was not supposed to happen. But then something else happened. John chapter 20, start with verse 1, says this. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Peter walked into that tomb that day a very depressed, desolate, defeated man. But from then on, nothing was ever the same. From the moment of seeing an empty tomb, everything changed. Now, it took a few days, some other meetings for it to all sink in for what was taking place here. But life was never going to be the same. Not because all of a sudden Peter became a better person, or not because he understood some teaching that Jesus had given, but because of where a body was, it no longer was there. And it changed everything. Now, if we're going to experience a changed life, if we're going to experience what Simon Peter and the other followers found and experienced that morning, we have to consider several things. And that's what I want us to look at today. And the first one is this, the fact of the empty tomb. The fact of the empty tomb. You know, most of history agrees that there was a man named Jesus who walked on this earth, that he was a great teacher, that he was arrested, he was had a trial, that he was executed, crucified. Most people agree with that on all different sides. Most people do not disagree with that. They agree that he was buried. They agree that something happened to the body. But then that's where people disagree, is what happened to the body. And that's where it comes down to. And so there are several theories about what happened to the body that day. Theory number one, someone stole the body. So who would have had the motive to steal the body? Was it the Roman soldiers? It says that a garrison guarded the tomb. That would have been 16 Roman soldiers. But what motive would they have had to steal the body and put their lives in danger? Because that would have meant that their lives were on the line for failing in their role. So they had no motive to do it. Was it the Jewish leaders who had Jesus crucified? The only motive that they could have had was to steal the body before the disciples could steal it, because they knew that Jesus had said he would rise again, and they would steal the body before the disciples did, and then when the disciples said, "See, he's risen from the dead," they could bring the body forth and humiliate them and destroy the whole movement. But that didn't happen. If the Roman soldiers stole the body, they never produced it again. The Jewish leaders, if they stole the body, they never produced it again. The disciples, could it have been them? Well, some problems exist if they had been the ones. Number one is that 16 Roman soldiers guarding the tomb. How would they have gotten by them to steal the body? Roll a stone away. And one little detail there in what I read, it says that the head cloth was neatly folded and was separate from the others. When you're stealing a body, you don't take time to fold the clothes. And then how would they have gotten back past the Roman soldiers? There's a lot of problems there. You know, they say that to pull off some kind of hoax like this, to do something this outlandish, there's usually one of the big three behind it. That the reason you'd do it, for money? Well, the disciples were notoriously poor, lived their lives in poverty. When they did get money, they gave it away. So it wasn't for money. Was it for power? They lived their lives as fugitives, on the run their entire life. They never had a home to call their own from then on. Either the Bible or Christian literature, history teaches us that every disciple, every apostle was murdered, executed for their faith in Christ, with the exception of John, and he spent his last days in exile. Well, was it for sex? They taught that the only way, that the lifestyle of sexual purity was only to be experienced in marriage. So none of the usual motivations to lead someone to do this kind of thing were present here. And there's one more motivation that was not present. You will do something like this to save your life. You won't do something like this that leads to you ending your life. Every one of these followers, if they pulled off this heist, this theft, never recanted, and they all died for that lie, if it was a lie. So none of the motivation fit. So theory one doesn't look too good. Theory number two is that Jesus didn't die. And see, and there are some who say that he appeared to die on the cross, and that the professional executioners made a mistake. He really wasn't dead. They took him down from the cross. They put him in the tomb, and that he revived once he was in the tomb, and he rolled the stone away, snuck by the Roman soldiers, appeared to his disciples, and convinced them that he had risen from the dead. But there's a lot of problems there. Professional executioners don't make those kind of mistakes. The Bible teaches us that they even rammed a spear through his side to make sure he was dead. And we forget something else. He was beaten by the Romans before he was crucified. Roman beatings were vicious. Many never survived the beatings before they were to even make it to crucifixion. So Jesus went through all of that and then was able to come back to his disciples in this beaten and battered state and convince them that he had risen from the dead. It just doesn't add up, does it? Well, there's a third option, third theory, and that's that Jesus did rise from the dead. It's the simplest explanation and the most compelling, and just as the Bible tells us. So then we're left with the question, if it's the simplest, it's the most compelling, then why don't people believe it? Well, I think the German philosopher Wolfhart Pannenberg answers that question very well. He wrote, "The evidence of Jesus' resurrection is so strong that nobody would question it except for two things. First, it is a very unusual event. And second, if you believe it happened, you have to change the way you live." He captured the reasons there in one statement. Some people will not even consider the resurrection because it was supernatural, that it was something out of the ordinary, and they will not even consider it. Ironically about this is most who will not even consider something supernatural happening are the people who say they do it in the name of science and critical thinking. But the irony of it is, to not consider something without looking at the evidence is the definition of closed-mindedness, is it not? And people will not even look at it because it was supernatural. God is not afraid of science. God is not afraid of critical thinking and any question we can throw at him. God is not afraid of it. But there are others who refuse to even consider the resurrection because they know if they believe it and admit that it's true, that then they will have to change their lives. And most do not want to change their life. Most do not want to answer to anybody else but themselves. And they know when they recognize that Jesus Christ lived, died, rose again, and lives in heaven, has promised to come back again, like Richard was saying around the community table, that we have to answer to somebody else. And most do not want to answer that. They've already made up their mind about these things. And so they will not give it a consideration. Other people will say things like, well, I can't believe in a God that would allow all the suffering that's in the world. Now, I have questions about that too. I have questions, and I wonder, and I shake my head sometimes, go, why is there... I just stood in the parking lot just the other day, and we said, it's hard to understand why so much tragedy is hitting so many people. But you see, and listen to this close, to have that question does not address the question of whether there is a God. That's two different things. Don't dismiss the evidence that there is a resurrection because you don't understand something else about God or about life. You see what I'm saying? That's two different things. You may not understand something about life or may not understand something about God, but that does not mean that you cannot prove that God is real. And some people do that. If I've described you in any of those theories right there, other than the last one that Jesus did rise from the dead, I want to ask you to do something. I want to ask you to mentally and spiritually and emotionally walk into that tomb just like Peter did and consider the evidence. Consider what's there. Consider the difference that it makes. Well, Peter did that, and he then had to deal with some things. Some things became very real to him. The first one is this, and that's the meaning of the empty tomb. The empty tomb meant some things to Peter. Three things I want to mention. The first thing that the empty tomb proves is that Jesus was who he said he was. That's what changed Peter's life here, one of the things. The risen Jesus, no matter what questions you have or the confusion and that Peter had that day, Prove that Jesus was who he said he was. Whether you understand it or not, a resurrection says that Jesus is who he said he was. You remember in Acts chapter 4, this just happened, weeks after the resurrection. So this is a big turnaround for Simon Peter, from being afraid to now he's being so bold. You remember when Peter and John were preaching? They arrested them, took them to prison, then they brought them out and said, we don't know what to do with these guys. They brought them out and they said, don't do this anymore. Don't talk about Jesus anymore. You remember what Peter said to them? Acts 4:19 and 20, he says, but Peter and John replied, judge for yourselves whether it's right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. For we cannot help speaking about what we've seen and heard. In other words, Peter was saying, guys, I know you've got a lot of degrees hanging on your wall. I can look at your robes and tell that you're the upper crust of the Jewish leaders. You're the greatest teachers they have. You have a lot of authority. You have a lot of political clout with the Roman government. You're probably a lot smarter than I am. But I think a risen Savior, an empty tomb, trumps degrees every day. And he was basically saying, guys, y'all do what you want to, think what you want. I know what I've seen and heard, so get ready. We'll be back. You're going to have to deal with us again. And that's what happened. See, faith is not having all your questions answered now. It is wrestling with the unexplainable, but knowing that it is undeniable that Jesus rose from the dead. Faith is not having all your questions answered now. It's dealing with the unexplainable, but knowing of the undeniable fact that Jesus rose from the dead. There are great definitions of faith, and here's another good one. Faith occurs when the unexplainable confronts the undeniable. Faith occurs when the unexplainable confronts the undeniable. And when that happens, you've got two choices. We all have two choices. We can dismiss the possibility of God, or we can humble ourselves before God and say, I believe. I don't understand everything, but I believe. The second thing that the empty tomb did for Simon Peter was this. He realized that his past no longer defined him. Now, if you remember, Simon Peter didn't end his earthly walk with Jesus on too much of a high note. You remember? He makes all these great boasts about how great he's going to be, and he'll stand by Jesus no matter what. He ends up running away. He comes around the campfire, curses him, denies him, and so he calls down and curses and says, I don't even know the man Jesus. You can imagine how terrible it would be to desert your best friend in that hour and then for him to come back from the dead. And you got to face him. What excuse have you got? This was the past that would define Simon Peter for the rest of his life, except there was a resurrection. And we know that Jesus in turn forgave him, and he went on to do great things. But it was the resurrection that made that possible. 1 Peter 1:3. There's two verses here I want to spend the rest of the time on here. 1 Peter 1:3. This is something that Simon Peter wrote. He said, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. He's saying because of the resurrection, we have a new birth into a living hope. Now, for a man who has a past that is going to define him forever, that's good news. For Peter to say, I have a new birth, I have a second chance, that really means something. And he says it's because of the resurrection. Too many people, and we do this to ourselves, too many of us, Christian and non-Christian, believe, or we at least operate like God's acceptance of us is based on how good we are. And so we go through life trying to be good enough until something happens like Simon Peter. And it's something you don't feel like you can ever come back from, that you'll never be good enough for God to have a relationship with you again. And we beat ourselves up and make ourselves miserable as Christians, and some never turn to Christ because they've done some terrible things and think that God would never get them, never accept them. The resurrection is God's declaration that the price that Jesus paid by dying for us, that it is accepted, it is paid in full, and everything is okay. By raising him from the dead, he is verifying that the crucifixion and the sacrifice was accepted. So despite our past, we have a new birth, a living hope. John Weiss is the minister of the Southland Christian Church in Lexington, Kentucky. And I was listening to one of his sermons, and he told a story about his son. He said his wife called him one day and said, "Your son." And parents, you know, whenever one parent calls the other one and doesn't use the child's name, doesn't say "our child," it says "your son," you know it's not a good day. And he said, his wife said, "Your son spray painted a large X on the driveway of our house." And he said, "I'll be home. I'll see what we can do." And he got home and said he came in the house, and it was this big orange X, as big as their driveway, painted on their driveway. And he came in, his son was standing behind his mom, and the tears were in his eyes, and said the first thing his little boy did was held out his hand. He had some money that he'd been saving for this toy he wanted to buy, and he'd been saving his allowance and stuff, and he held it, and he took the money but handed it back to his son. He said, "Son, I don't want that." He said, and he talked to him about what he did. He said, "Now come on, let's go down to Lowe's, and I bet they have something that'll take paint off of concrete." And he said, we went down there and we bought the stuff, and he said, but then I came back and spent hours on my hands and knees in the driveway with steel wool and this chemical getting the paint off of the driveway. He said, like a week later, John's brother came to visit, and his little nephew, this first thing he says, "Come on." He said, "I want to show you what I did." And he took him outside and he showed him where he had painted on the sidewalk, or on the driveway, but how it was gone now. And the uncle said, "I bet your dad made you clean it up." And he said, "No." He said, "I wasn't strong enough to make the stain go away, but my dad was. I wasn't strong enough to make the stain go away, but my dad was." You see, that's what Jesus does for us. That's the whole thing. If we were strong enough to make the stain go away, he didn't need to come. But we're not strong enough. Churches today are filled. Heaven will be filled with people who have a past that would have defined them. Drugs, alcohol, unfaithfulness, jail, kicked out of school, filled with hate, bitterness, racism, revenge. But God was strong enough to make the stain go away. Final thing I want to point out that Simon Peter learned by the resurrection was this. His future was secure. Let me pick up with verse 4 there in 1 Peter. It says, "And into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you." Before the resurrection, Peter had no idea what his future was going to be, but none of it looked good. But he wrote that afterwards, that he had an inheritance that would never perish or spoil or fade, and it was kept in heaven. You know, the older I get, the older we get, the more we understand that things fade, things spoil, things wear out, things go away. Whether it be our health, whether it be something that we had put our hope and our trust in, whether it be the love of someone, maybe it be even the fact that people that we love pass away and leave us. But we realize on this earth that things spoil and they fade and they pass away. But in the midst of that, we also realize that the promise of heaven does not fade. It does not pass away. It does not fade. Simon Peter here says, because of the resurrection, I am assured of eternity. You know, when we have something, have you noticed this, that when we have something, if we have some money, if we have some land, if we have a pension, if we have an IRA, if we have something, you know what usually happens to us? We're thankful for a little while that we have it, then we start wondering, is it going to be enough? Is somebody going to take it away from us? You know, isn't that true? We start, and we realize the peace doesn't come in those things because we're afraid somebody's going to take them. But Jesus says yours is kept in heaven. Nobody can get to it. Nobody can take it away. It's ours, waiting for us. That's what the resurrection did for one man. That's what it did for the world. Well, we're at the end of our series here. Now the question is not so much did Jesus make the headlines. The question is this: what is your headline? Because of the headlines that Jesus made, what would be the headline that you make? Will this make a difference in your life? The headlines we read of it, and particularly the one today, that Jesus rose from the dead. Will it make a difference in your life? What's the headline going to read of your life? See, because too many people just, they think if I just close my ears and my eyes and pretend that God doesn't exist, then it doesn't apply to me. The resurrection applies to all of us. We will bow before Jesus someday. The key is we bow willingly now or not by our choice later. It applies to us all.